Hello and welcome to the American Compass podcast. My name is Oren. I am the chief economist here at American Compass, and today we are talking trade with China. American Compass just published today, actually, a really fantastic paper looking at what it would mean to withdraw what's called PNTR, Permanent Normal Trade Relations, from China. You may recall back in 2001 timeframe, granting them that status is what unleashed the current wave of globalization and deindustrialization in America. People are now ready to undo it, but what that would actually mean turns out to be a lot more complicated than you might think. And so American Compass policy advisor Mark DiPlacido has been working on this for a while. He's the lead author of the paper, and he is the guest on the podcast. So I think a really important conversation, especially in the context of what is legislation that is likely to move forward over the coming year. It's a recommendation of the bipartisan House China Select Committee. It's in the Republican platform. And Senators Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, and Josh Hawley have just put forward a really good bill that goes the same way. So definitely something important to get up to speed on, and Mark does a fantastic job laying it all out. Before we get to that, got to tell you about what else is going on the Commons. A couple of really good pieces recently, one from Bruno Mano, looking at how the UK approaches non-college pathways. Mike Needham on the immigrant crisis in Charleroi and the way that reliance on migrant labor in particular is undermining a lot of smaller communities in the United States. Also this week, we'll have Patrick Brown on poverty, and I am writing the Compass Point. You may have seen me talking a lot about tariffs lately. I'm not done yet, and the next volley will be coming on that topic. So keep an eye out for all of that. Hopefully you are already subscribed to the Substack, Understanding America. If I haven't told you already, we have a classy new URL, understandingamerica.co. .com, of course, is so 1990s. So please check that out. Check out all that great stuff on the Commons and enjoy this conversation with Mark DiPlacido.
All right. And joining us today on the podcast, none other than policy advisor Mark DiPlacido. First time on the podcast. Drew, can we get an air horn? How are you, Mark?
I'm doing well, Oren. Great to be with you.
We are excited to talk about the new paper that you have been working on for quite some time. It's very heavy as far as I could tell. That it has a cool title.
Yes, Disfavored Nation.
Disfavored Nation, very nice. And what is it?
It's about ending China's permanent normal trade relations with the United States. And so basically what we did, had four objectives with the paper. First, to sort of lay out a brief history of U.S. trade policy, just to situate the change. Secondly, trying to make sure we're setting the right target for the policy. There's a lot of different aspects of trade policy and a lot of different goals that policymakers have in the trade space with China. We want to make sure that the conversation stays centered on what the policy change would actually change. Next, we detail the best way to go about making those changes. And lastly, we address other trade issues with China that the policymakers should be aware of to set the context.
All right. Well, we will run you through all four of those, but let's start by backing up. For our listeners who are not intimately familiar with PNTR, Permanent Normal Trade Relations, it used to be called Most Favored Nation status. The premise is essentially a reciprocal one. We will treat some other country as well as we treat any country. You will be most favored, although really just means not any more favored than anyone else, like all of your children, of course. And presumably in return, they will treat us the same way, and then we can all be in the World Trade Organization together. Is that close enough?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. So really the current world trade paradigm emerged shortly after World War II. The United States, emerging from that war, and Europe emerging from that war, started to stare down the Soviet Union, obviously under the Cold War. And so that set up kind of a bipolar system, and the United States really intended to use trade to sort of build its coalitional bloc of allies. And so as part of doing that, the United States set up a system where they would bring in new nations and everybody would grade each other essentially non-discriminatory in a non-discriminatory way, meaning the trade relationship that any of the partners had with each other would apply to all of the partners.
So the French can't just go stick it to the West Germans.
Correct. And so over time, it spelled from 23 nations to almost all of the nations by the time the World Trade Organization was set up in the early 90s. And then China was added later in 2001.
And so China's an interesting case because China, my understanding is they actually, in a sense, where the U.S. also afforded them very good treatment, but it wasn't guaranteed the way, right? China was not part of the WTO. And so Congress actually had to vote on this every year. What was the state of play until we get to 2000?
Yeah. So in the early 70s, right, there started to become an issue with communist countries, and some of them were allowing immigration, largely of Jewish citizens, out of their countries. So the United States decided that we should not be having trade with countries that don't respect basic human rights.
Those were the days.
Those were the days. And so Congress granted the president an ability to make an exemption to issue a waiver for specific countries that Congress could then come back and overrule. So starting in 1980, the president started to give China this exemption that applied for 1 year. And Congress had the opportunity to roll it back, but it never did. And so for about 20 years, China had free trade with the United States, but on an annual basis. And of course, they didn't probably in normal trade relations until 2000.
And so there was this big debate in the late 90s. Should China be afforded this status? It's very funny to me. This is when every other country still uses the term MFN, most favored nation. That's what's written in the WTO. American politicians decided to change it to permanent normal trade relations because MFN, most favored nation, sounded like too nice a thing for us to give China. Whereas PNTR sounded bureaucratic and obscure. It's in a sense the Inflation Reduction Act of our trade policy, if you will.
Right, and I would say that's accurate. And I think if you ask the average American that it's right that we have the same trade terms and the same tariff rates for a country like Great Britain and Australia that we have with China, I think the common sense answer or the common sense perspective would be that doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Right. Is China the most favored nation? No. Well, how do you feel about normal trade relation? But I could go for that. They do make a lot of cheap stuff. So that was the basis. And this was then, of course, still a massive debate around basically the end of the Clinton administration. You had a few folks, I would say, in public, in prominent positions saying, wait a minute. But virtually everybody made the case that this was the sort of future, the unstoppable future direction of globalization. And by the way, this was how we were going to democratize China, liberalize China. For those who have never checked out Wrong All Along, American Compass, just go Google American Compass Wrong All Along. It's maybe my favorite project we've ever done because it's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of quotes from everybody across political spectrum, featuring, of course, our friends, the economists, more than anyone, making these just outlandish, over-the-top guarantees that nobody with half a brain could possibly dispute that this was going to be a brilliant thing to do. And then we did it. And how has that been going on?
Right. As our longer paper, Hard Break from China points out, this did not go according to plan. Most people would look at China today and not see a blooming democratic country. They would see a centrally planned mercantilist economy that looks like it's cut far more out of the 19th century than out of the 21st century.
And the effect for the U.S. that, of course, has been the hollowing out of the American industrial base, the skyrocketing trade deficit. I think it's really important to emphasize and goes to the disingenuousness of the claims made at the time that one thing economists said was, well, wait a minute, we already give China this status. So we're not actually giving up anything by making it permanent, but we'll get a lot back by virtue of being in this trade organization with China. And it sort of just, even at first glance, was one of these absurd things like, well, then why do you care so much about it? Right. And why was it so different? What did it mean to go from just, we will review this every year to you are now forevermore a member of the WTO?
Right. So for most of the 20th century, the United States did not have a trade deficit, had a trade surplus. And around the early 1980s, actually, when China was first granted the annual status, is when we started to see the trade deficit start to creep up. That remained sort of at a trickle in the early 90s. It was still under 100 billion a year. After 2001, that number absolutely skyrocketed. And China represented an overwhelming percentage of that increase. Right now, they still represent about a third of our trade deficit. And, alongside of that, there was also the argument that we had to make this change, that it was going to be, transformational. And now you see on the other side of it saying, well, we've had this system for 20 years. It'll be too painful to change it. And so there's a disingenuousness there in the argument as well. Whereas this was going to be a transformational policy 20 years ago. We would agree that it has been transformational, but in the wrong direction. Now is the time to change it again and put the world trade back in balance.
And so, what you see with permanent normal trade relations, you have all of basically corporations go from, we can try some stuff out in China to, okay, we can make all of the big long-term investments there. I think it's really interesting, even Peterson Institute, the sort of most prominent advocates for essentially borderless trade, are out with a new paper defending PNTR. And one of the bases they do this on is to say, let's be clear, going from an annual review to permanent normal trade it is exactly what unleashed these sort of wave of investment and offshore. And so, to your point, it would indeed be conversely very disruptive in the other direction to eliminate PNTR. There's a surprising amount of support for it. So it is a recommendation of the bipartisan House China Select Committee. It is in the Republican Study Committee China plan. It is in the Republican Convention platform. But what actually happens? What do you do if China is not treated as a WTO partner anymore?
Sure. So at a basic level, in the 1980s, the worldwide trade system, as I said, it grew from 23 nations to almost all of them, developed what's called the harmonized system. And basically that attributes an 8-digit or 10-digit code to every single good that's traded in the worldwide economy. The United States has a version of this called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, in which they place tariff rates on each of those goods at the 8-digit level. And currently, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, or the ATS, HTS, has 2 columns. The first is the MFN, or Most Favored Nation column, the column that applies to every nation that enjoys normal trade relations with the United States. And a second column 2. And the rates in those columns are basically a default rate left over from the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s. Currently, column 2 only applies to 4 countries, North Korea and Cuba, and recently, only as of the last couple of years, Russia and Belarus.
Yeah, and so first of all, I recommend to our listeners, go check out the Harmonized Tariff Schedule. It's a lot of fun. You'll feel, it gets down to, right, it's like, be hello for use in whatever, right? Like, if you think about, well, how many codes are there? There tens of thousands, tens of thousands?
There are around, I believe, 13,000 at the 8-digit line, to the level at which goods receive a specific tariff rate.
Right. And so to your point, pre-WTO world, and if you go back to the history of tariffs, typically any country would have some way of listing pretty much everything you could bring into the country, and then a tariff rate next to it. WTO system, get away from that. We say, all right, our most favored nation tariff, well, first is 0. There are some places where it's a little bit higher. Is going to apply to everybody except for Cuba and North Korea. And then Russian dollars is really interesting because people said you can't take away PNT, right? Well, actually, when people got angry enough at Russia a couple of years ago, turned out it was very easy to take away PNT. Well, what actually happened there? Was it legislation? Did the world fall apart?
Sure. So as you stated, each country, as they join the WTO or as a condition of membership in the WTO, has a set of concessions that they give. So that's both a set of tariff rates that they've agreed to keep bound, call them bound tariff rates. The U.S. has the lowest in the world at around 3.4% on average, and also other trade practices as well. But for these purposes, it's probably the most relevant portion. China or Russia was not admitted to the WTO until 2012. So it is a more recent member. Under the WTO rules, countries can cite national security concerns to withdraw concessions from specific trade partners. And Russia, if the dispute settlement system in the WTO is fully functioning, which it hasn't been since around 2018, when the United States stopped confirming new members of the appellate body, they would have their day in court. They could challenge the United States and say that this was an illegal move under the World Trade Organization agreement. But they would basically only have recourse to tariff the United States in return. And so the United States has held, and this is one of the reasons why they've walked new appointments to the appellate body, which has become activist in similar ways to the Supreme Court, that the United States makes determinations about what is in its national security interests, not an international body, and certainly not one that's geared towards economic concerns in the first place.
And so, as happened with Russia, if we were to, because PNTR asked by Congress, it's sort of withdrawing that PNTR status likewise, essentially has to go through Congress. In theory, you could write the one paragraph bill that just does that. I think there may even be one out there that essentially does that. And the result of that is China just lands in column 2. And we now treat China the way we treat North Korea or Cuba. I mean, not necessarily the same sanctions, but is basically facing a leftover 1930s trade model. The thrust of the paper is to recognize that, in a sense, this is the harder part, right? The paragraph saying you are no longer PNTR, nobody could write. Figure out what should come instead, besides, well, let's go back to 1930. That's where I think, frankly, a lot of the policy thinking had not existed. So how do you approach that? First, at the broad level, what should this look like? What do you do with a system where China's not in column 1?
Sure, absolutely. I would add, just to wrap up the WTO conversation, I would add as well that the Trump administration's approach to the Section 301 tariffs, which were the 25% tariffs, I've laid on a few $100 billion in Chinese goods, and starting in 2018, those also went outside of the WTO system. And we haven't seen the world trade system fall apart as a result of that. So there's already precedent to the United States acting unilaterally in its relationship with China. So we should keep that in mind as well. When it comes to fixing the tariff rates that apply to China under the new trade relations, what I would argue are the normal trade relations that we should have with a nation like China. You have a few different options. You could, first of all, on the rate side, you could just default to the column 2 rates. Those rates average somewhere between 30 and 50%, but a lot of those rates were determined in the 30s, and we had a completely different economy. So the heaviest tariffs applied to agriculture and manufacturing at the time. And currently, the United States relies on China and other economies, even like Russia, for basic commodities. And so those are where a lot of our strategic vulnerabilities lie today. So it's not strategically the best solution to just rely on column 2. It's been 100 years almost since those rates were set. It's time to envision a new approach. So what we did in our paper was design a system for a new column, a column 3. And the way we went about that was to ask, okay, how should we consider goods under that new schedule? Because each good will get a tariff rate. And what we decided to do was to separate goods as either strategic or non-strategic. For strategic goods, we're recommending 100% tariff rate. We looked at a number of other trade actions to determine the economic effects to be, where there might be precedent. For strategic goods, there's four buckets, and I don't want to get ahead of the conversation, but we're essentially, to put the question simply, if we were to have another COVID pandemic, for example, or if we were to get sucked into a war where China were on the other side, where there were another type of emergency, what goods would we not want to rely on Chinese supply chains for? And I think more than anything, right, President Trump started this conversation really in 2015, 2016, when he started rowing on the threat of China to the integrity of our economy. But 2020 really accelerated the conversation, I think, beyond what anyone could have imagined. And yet over the last 4 years, there's been, a really disappointing level of action in response to the vulnerabilities that we saw that year. We had shortages well into 2022, supply chain disruptions well into 2023. And that contributed a lot to shortages and to the inflation problem as well. I don't want to mix up price increases and inflation, but a lot of the price increases that we saw, especially immediately after the pandemic, were due to these systemic vulnerabilities. And so if something like that can happen and our lawmakers do nothing in response, and we're still relying on China for generic pharmaceutical precursors, for syringes, for critical minerals, for printed circuit boards, for basic commodities that our economy relies on and our most advanced technologies rely on, we're not having a serious enough conversation. So when we're thinking about strategic, we really took as expansive a view of the definition as we could, and we relied on 9 government lists that we found, and some foreign lists as well, just so policymakers have some reference points.
Implicit in this framework is a recognition that this is the point in drawing PNTR, right? That one could say, and one made that very with Russia, this is what happened. It was more of a diplomatic statement, slap in the face, in a sense. And so, you could say that, well, the goal here is to insult China, and this isn't the way to do it. But that probably wouldn't be ideal for policymaking. Here, the core reason for being unhappy with the normal trade relations with China is that, in essence, through China's explicit policies, they have sought to both deindustrialize the U.S. and dominate and monopolize the supply of a lot of particularly commodities and sort of products that are vital to supply chains. And so to your point, then withdrawing PNTR and starting to put tariffs on these things, because that will just apply to China, as we saw with the Trump tariffs, that doesn't necessarily mean, okay, the things you're tariffing are therefore the things that are going to come back to the U.S. They might go to Vietnam or Mexico. But to your point, if what we're concerned about is resilience and not wanting to be dependent on China, then PNTR withdrawal and being able to think, okay, what does in fact need to no longer come from China into the U.S. economy is kind of exactly what we're going after. And so you mentioned, okay, we're going to have strategic goods, non-strategic goods. 100% tariff seems fairly aggressive. Though, why not 10,000%? Why not 20%?
Sure. So to determine the 100% rate, we looked again at different trade actions that have been taken in the past. The trade measure that most commonly imposes tariffs at that rate are anti-dumping and countervailing duties. We cite 6 or 10 examples of different duties that have been applied for rates ranging from 60% to 200%. 200% sort of fell in the middle of the range of those, and each of those actions resulted in a near total decline in reliance in trade on those goods for the countries that were tariffed. So we saw historically how that rate has been successful. With that said, we do recommend a 5-year review of the rates to make sure dependence is actually declining.
And the intuition here, in a sense, is to say, look, we have a country, even China, that could be the cheapest supplier of something. Almost never is it going to be literally half. Like, nobody else can even come within twice the cost. And so if you have 100% tariff from China, you're basically saying if someone else can supply at less than twice the cost, they are going to become the preferred supplier. 25% for non-strategic goods, why any tariff on non-strategic goods?
Sure. So the overall trade deficit with China is still a problem, right? And China has shown in the past, good that we tariff, they will start to move their subsidies and dump their subsidies in other industries in their country, right? And the surplus overall allows China to use the money that we give them to come back and purchase American assets, as we've documented and shown in other papers. And so that overall imbalance and the structural vulnerability in the economy represented by that balance needs to be addressed as well. And that can really only be addressed if tariffs are covered a universal set of goods.
And so in those other goods ending, the effect in practice then is essentially to say, look, we may still get a lot of this stuff from China, but first of all, if you're deciding, particularly if you're an American company and you're deciding where to move production to, we would like China to be further down your list, essentially, for a full range of reasons. And so, okay, so fast forward then past, we've sort of got to day one and day two, right? Day one is like, okay, you're not PNTR anymore. Okay, but well, where are you? Day two, okay, we have this column for you. Particularly given the centrality of the U.S.-China relationship to the global trade system, to a point with the Trump tariffs, we didn't cause the collapse of the global economy or, in fact, any noticeable negative effect on prices and so forth at the aggregate level, but it obviously alters incentives dramatically. So what are the other considerations that arise? What are the other things that either legislation has to directly address or that policymakers just have to be thinking through and anticipating?
Sure. So I think the biggest concern, and this is maybe, what policymakers should consider a leak in the policy in general with China is that they have basically started pursuing tariff evasion measures. And there's three different ways they do this. First is just straight up illegal transshipments, they call them. So this would be largely or wholly manufactured in China goods that they ship through third markets. This could be Thailand and Malaysia, Vietnam. Secondly,
and so just some the product goes from China to Malaysia, they scrape off the made in China sticker, they slap on a made in Malaysia sticker and send it on into the US without the tariff that shouldn't have.
Correct. And that under trade law is fraudulent and currently is illegal.
Shocking that they were doing that. That's
yes.
Not in keeping with their commitment to the norms of the international trading system.
No. Secondly, so as a matter of trade policy, goods as they come in are given a country of origin, and the country of origin is determined by the last country that under which a substantial transformation in the good was completed or done. So there are these intermediate cases where maybe China does a large part of the manufacturing of the underlying good, but small tweaks are made in third countries and then shipped. The United States should really evaluate its rules for substantial transformation for manufactured goods and make sure that those types of minor modifications are not changing the country of origin for U.S. trade purposes. And then third is what's called cross-border production, and this is what we're seeing, especially in Mexico, over the last 2 to 4 years. And so essentially what that is a Chinese-owned company will set up a factory in a third country, and then a majority of the labor and a lot of the actual production does go on in that third country, but it's owned and possibly subsidized by a Chinese company overall. And that's where the United States, that's the next phase of this conversation. Obviously, another major trade initiative under the Trump administration was for writing NAFTA, USMCA. Under those rules, China is able to do this. USMCA is up for reevaluation in 2026, and that's going to need to be a large part of the conversation, especially when a lot of the industries that China's bringing into Mexico are automobiles, specifically EVs. And I think part of the argument there needs to be, look, part of the benefit to the rest of the world of the United States shutting off, its normal trade relations with China is that the United States market is now open to all of these other countries. And part of the understanding there needs to be, okay, some of our trade demand is going to flow to you, Mexico, to you, India, to you, Malaysia, to you, Vietnam. We have some expectations on the other end of this. Part of the reason we're purchasing from you is so that we're not purchasing for China. And so there needs to be a mutual understanding established with these countries that we're not going to buy Chinese, even if your laborers make the parts. We can't do that because they're still going to be heavily subsidized. They're still going to be distorted. And in the case of advanced technologies, there's still security vulnerabilities there as well.
Right. And to your point that this is sort of the next frontier in a sense, it really does change kind of underlying calculus of the trade regime. I mean, the way that the late 20th century trading system was set up, it was geography that mattered, right? If Coca-Cola sets up a bottling plant in Mexico, that's a Mexican plant. It's using Mexican labor, it's operating under Mexican laws, it's using Mexican water, and it may also spend bottles from another country, and those are that country's bottles, and that's how we thought about it. No one would make no sense for another country to look at that Coca-Cola coming from Mexico and say, "Wait a minute, that's American. That's American Coca-Cola." I mean, maybe if they had, if they'd been more cognizant of our soft power, they would have worried more about that. But generally speaking, that was fine. It was just an economic question of whose labor and materials is going into the stuff. And with China, what we're essentially saying is our concerns are different from that. I mean, to some extent, privy today, to the extent that China is actually as competitive firms making things in comply with human rights requirements and so forth, we would welcome that product from China. The problem is that any company operating in China and any Chinese company operating elsewhere is ultimately controlled by and accountable to the Chinese Communist Party. It is all of the logic of market economies that we assumed was the foundation of the trading system doesn't apply. And so, BYD is sort of a classic example of a Chinese EV maker. A BYD factory in Mexico is that it is physically in Mexico is a lot less interesting than the fact that every production decision it makes is ultimately a decision of the Chinese government, and every piece of information it has ultimately is accessible to the Chinese government. And that is now what we're grappling with.
No, and if you sort of zoom out on, the global trade imbalance, right, which I think, at American Compass and certainly the way I look at trade is the ultimate issue. That imbalance comes at the expense of the middle class in both the United States and in China, right? A lot of its ability to dominate these sectors is through government subsidies, suppressed consumption, currency manipulation, these tactics that extract capital from the wider economy in both countries and place it in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party to direct where they will, and to direct it fundamentally at industries that are meant to dominate the 21st century at the expense of America. So adding these third countries in still does not address, the underlying problem at the end of the day.
And so if we actually go down this path and say, okay, we like USMCA, we like the idea of relatively free trade between US, Mexico, and Canada, but we are not only not interested in a car made in China being shipped internationally from the US, we're not even interested in trading with Mexico if Mexico is opening up to Chinese companies. It seems to me where you start heading very quickly is a world where everybody's basically going to have to pick a side. The reason that the people who dreamed of the wonderful new global world order resisted all this stuff is because there are sort of only two equilibria. Either everybody truly does get on board and you can have the open system, or you have systems in conflict and maintaining sort of half the interrelationship doesn't really work. And so you would also expect China to retaliate against us and presumably started making similar demands of the country closest to its network. Is that where this then kind of heads? You end up with more what look like two trading blocks without a whole lot of economic interaction between them?
I think that is the direction we're headed. And the problem is, right, nobody wants a trade war, right? Everybody would like a system where there is just, this utopia of open markets and perfect comparative advantage and everything, everyone's a rational actor and there are no other considerations. The problem is it's not the world that we're living in, and it's never been the way the world has worked. And so at a point where historically over the last 30 to 40 years has not played out the way it was theoretically supposed to, one has to revisit, right? And another way that this is framed is, nobody wants a trade war, but there's been a trade war going on for 20 or more years. The United States just decided to start fighting back 5 or 6 years ago. This was a strategy and a deliberate decision by China to continue to pursue this economic model. And the problem with that is it's if you don't play back, you just lose. So no, we also tried. I mean, the Trump administration's approach was very much with the hope of getting China to stand down on these policies and to come to a deal. And there was what I would say was a pretty strong deal with opportunities for enforcement in it that came at the end of 2019, 2020, and this is where we are today. We went through that. We had a deal, and then we had this pandemic that was unleashed on the world that showed all of these vulnerabilities in our supply chains. And then over the next couple of years, China did not abide by that deal. And, for most of the last 4 years, the tariffs have been maintained. Some new tariffs have been put on. There's been a certain level of vigilance, but the Biden administration has just not taken this problem seriously. It has not enforced the phase 1 agreement, and it has maintained, small yard, high fence, very targeted approach to this problem when something really, really bigger and structural is needed here. And that gets into to national security, right? The small yard, high fence is we're going to pick a few strategic industries where we're going to separate, but the rest of our economy is fine. When everybody knows for the last, 100 years, right, longer than that probably, since the Industrial Revolution, economies win wars as much as weapons do, because those weapons in the larger system is dependent on industrial commons, is dependent on innovation, is dependent on labor and on resources that if we're not equipped to provide, to harness, to mine, to build, we will lose. And it's time to make a major change.
Yeah, it's great point. The small yard high fence is the perfect example of this sort of can we just go halfway? We can still have our wonderful open trading system. We just won't give them advanced AI chips or something. And then to your point about why in an actual conflict, what's the issue? It's okay, well, is steel inside the small yard high fence? Is the automotive sector in small yard high fence? It breaks down very quickly. I also thought the point you made about kind of this 20-year learning period in a sense is so important. And this ends, we mentioned another paper we'd done last year called A Heartbreak with China. And this is where we just said, oh, look, let's actually use the benefit of hindsight. If policymakers had known in the year 2000 that China was not going to liberalize, it was not going to democratize, in fact, it was going to go pretty hard the other direction, to some extent in its politics and certainly in an economic strategy that just sought to exploit and undermine every, whole bridge to it. would you still have stood up there and said, yes, we should have free global trade relations with China? Well, I mean, look, I think given the people who are still defending it today, the reality is probably a lot of them would say yes and just come up with some other pretextual reason to do it. But in terms of the actual intellectually coherent case for it, it just falls apart. Knowing what we know now, it does not make sense to have permanent global trade relations with China. And it is unlikely to for a very long time. Where do you think this goes? We mentioned some of the groups, both sides of the aisle, that are excited about this kind of thing. Do you see this being something that is likely to in fact happen in the next 4 years? And how much does the election matter in it?
Sure. Well, I can only look at my personal experience. I got to DC in 2015, and at the time, nobody was talking about trade. And now it's such a substantial portion of the conversation. In that debate with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, it was the first and bulk of the economic questions and conversation in the debate. So it's a front and center issue. I also look at the way people in DC screamed bloody murder about Trump's trade actions. Every page of Bloomberg, of all the financial newspapers, magazines, the supposed center of the business interests, the way they reacted to those actions was like it was going to destroy our economy. And you have a report out from even the Peterson Institute, which is pretty anti-tariff, pro-free trade, that said there was only a one-time 0.26 increase in consumer prices from those tariffs. And the opposing party decided to keep them on and has continued to wrap itself in this same strong on China rhetoric, pro-manufacturing, pro-worker rhetoric of the Trump administration. So it seems to be the new center of the conversation, or at least something that rhetorically must be paid homage to. Whether Congress and the next administration is going to get its legs out under it enough to actually act and to actually do something that will fix the problem, rather than, kick the can down the road, is an open question. But I'm optimistic given how far we've come in the last 8 or 9 years versus where we were a decade ago. And I think, frankly, the problem is just it's not gotten better, and more people are aware.
All right, we will leave it there. The paper is Disfavored Nation. The policy advisor is Mark DiPlacido. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Oren.
And we will be back again soon with another episode of the American Compass Podcast.